I'd like to welcome you to this, the first of two events co-convened by the Charles Perkins Centre and the Sydney Law School. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge and pay respect to the traditional owners of the land upon which we meet, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. It's upon their ancestral lands that the University of Sydney is housed. As we share our knowledge, teaching, learning and research practices within the university, we also pay respect to the knowledge embodied forever within the Aboriginal custodianship of country. The Charles Perkins Centre is a major initiative of the University of Sydney to ease the burden of obesity, diabetes and cardiovascular disease by generating collaborative interdisciplinary research and education. What's distinctive about this initiative, which is physically embodied in the new research precinct, the hub of which this is one small part. You've seen most of it towering over you to that side as you walked in, and a great deal more of it is hidden underground somewhere over in that direction. What's distinctive about this project is that it's bringing together many of our existing best minds in medical sciences with people from parts of the university you might not think were closely concerned with obesity, diabetes, and cardiovascular disease. Experts from the arts and social sciences, from architecture, from business studies, education, social work, engineering and information technology, and our basic physical life and environmental sciences. It's a truly cross-campus initiative on a very large scale. And I think the size of the new facility indicates the depth of the university's commitment to this project. That's why when we're discussing this topic of the nanny state, as well as the discipline of public health, who's been concerned with that concept and with the problems around it for a very long time, the symposium that we're holding tomorrow, which you'll talk about a bit more in a moment, draws on disciplines as diverse as political philosophy, law, and as in tonight's public oration, the discipline of marketing. So to introduce the specific events this evening, I'll hand over to my co-convener at this event, Professor Roger Magnuson from the Sydney Law School.
Thanks, Paul, and it's a pleasure on behalf of Sydney Law School to welcome you here tonight. As Paul said, tonight's public lecture is the first of a multidisciplinary two-part symposium called Who's Afraid of the Nanny State? Freedom, Regulation and the Nation's Health. The nanny state has become a popular metaphor in debates about public health regulation. Australia seems to have a deep and abiding fear of the nanny state, but less capacity to identify and debate the competing public interests and private interests that relate to public health regulation. Instead, the very mention of the nanny state has become a kind of rhetorical checkmate, a slogan against the very activity of government itself. And with tonight's lecture and the conference tomorrow, we want to confront the epidemic of nanny state name-calling and to encourage a more productive discussion. We want to ask questions like, in what circumstances is it appropriate for governments to take action to protect public health? What things specifically should governments do or not do? And what makes governments take action? These are the key questions that the speakers will discuss tomorrow. Tomorrow's keynote speakers include Professor Philip Pettit, who is Lawrence Rockefeller University Professor of Politics and Human Values at Princeton University, Professor Rogan Kirsch, Professor of Political Science and the Provost of Wake Forest University, the Honourable Judy Moylan, who is President of Diabetes Australia and Co-Chair of the National Diabetes Strategy Advisory Group, Professor Janet Herc, who is Professor of Marketing at Otago Business School in Dunedin, New Zealand, and Professor Michael Moore, who is Chief Executive Officer of the Australian Public Health Association. Debates about the nanny state are not new, but they have a particular salience when it comes to policies for reducing behavioural or lifestyle-related risk factors, including tobacco use, harmful use of alcohol, poor diet and overweight. And our response to these risks has been pretty weak in places. Australia has some of the highest rates of overweight and obesity in the world. In fact, nearly 63% of adults are either overweight or obese, and a quarter of children are either overweight or obese. Personal responsibility and corporate social responsibility are both important concepts. For many years now, we've been having a natural experiment with these concepts, relying heavily on them, and the results seem to be poor. In a democracy like Australia, we can vote for as much health as we want. But if Australians do want to live healthier and longer lives, we'll need to innovate. Some of those innovations may take regulatory form, and some forms of regulation may be different from what people imagine. Tonight's oration is entitled, "How do the food, alcohol and tobacco industries shape the consumption choices of the population?" The keynote speaker is Professor Gerard Hastings. Professor Hastings is an expert in social marketing and an innovative public health leader. He's a professor at the University of Stirling in Scotland and also at the Open University and at the l'École des Hautes Études en Santé Publique in France. Gerard will speak for about 45 minutes, and then in response to Gerard's talk, Professor Catriona Mackenzie will also speak. Professor Mackenzie is a professor of philosophy at Macquarie University. Please would you welcome Professor Gerard Hastings.
Your life is your life. Don't let it be clubbed into dank submission. Be on the watch. There are ways out. There is a light somewhere. May not be much light, but it beats the darkness. Be on the watch. The gods will offer you chances. Know them, take them. You can't beat death, but you can beat death in life sometimes. And the more you learn to do it, the more light there will be. Your life is your life. Know it while you have it. You are marvelous. The gods wait to rejoice in you. Those powerful words were written by this man, Charles Bukowski, a poet sometimes referred to as a beat poet from North America. He spent his life living amongst the marginalised and the dispossessed, doing dead-end jobs, living in the world where people have been forgotten. And that poem, The Laughing Heart, was his attempt to speak to them and say that even in the reduced circumstances they found themselves, they had some power. They could take some control. They didn't need to be kicked about by life. And tonight, I want to talk about that issue of power that we all have, that we should start to think about using and exercise with ever more energy. The Bukowski poem, The Laughing Heart, is also a powerful starting point for tonight because it first came to my attention when my son sent it to me as a YouTube link where it was being used as an advert by Levi's. So a poem that had been written to try and pick the dispossessed off their knees had been co-opted by a major multinational corporation to sell apparel, to attach a bit of cool imagery to apparel, to sell it to an audience, a target group that already had far too much stuff anyway. And it struck me that that balance of power there, the power that Bukowski talks about, of ordinary people to express themselves, to make the most of their lives, to do what they can, albeit often in very difficult circumstances, circumstances themselves that have to be challenged, versus, on the other hand, the power of marketing, what I've called the marketing matrix, the advertising and promotion that surrounds our lives, the distribution of products almost everywhere, the persistent and constant shopping opportunities that seem to characterize our lives. Increasingly, it seems to me, our job is simply to shop. What I would like to do this evening, with your help, is start challenging that sort of power and thinking about how we can foster this. I'm under no illusions that what I am attempting to do is big. The marketing matrix is a phenomenally big part of our world. Many people here probably work in it in some shape, sense, or form. This is a quote from a paper written in North America a dozen years ago now, basically lauding the fact that marketing is so pervasive. I love that last line. Just counting the money being used in the American marketing system would take 150 millennia, longer than the whole period of human civilization. It's about 200 years since the Industrial Revolution, and that's where we've got to. If we carry on like this, where will we be in another 200 years? All this is having a profound impact on every aspect of our lives, our communities, and increasingly our planet. I know that's quite an unpopular thing to say in Australia, that the idea of anthropomorphic climate change is kind of not politically correct all of a sudden. But I want to put it to you that, leave aside the climate scientists and their debates, a world in which ever-increasing consumption is pitted against a finite planet is bound to hit problems at some point. The only question is when. But these are big changes. And I want to take comfort in calling for such change from a very famous guy in my home country of Scotland, a guy called Jimmy Reid. I don't know if people remember Jimmy Reid. He was the trade union leader that led the workers' takeover of the Upper Clyde shipbuilders in the 1960s. Jimmy Reid was not just a good trade union leader. He was a very wise man, one of his generation's great orators. And he became rector of Glasgow University, an illustrious institution, almost as illustrious as Sydney University. And his address was considered so impressive at the time. It was published in its entirety in the New York Times. And what he was saying at that point is the sort of changes we need require social and cultural, and if you wish, spiritual transformation of our country. And I want to touch on that today, the idea of a spiritual transformation. Not necessarily in a religious sense, although that may be your bag and fine if it is. I just mean in the sense of life having some higher purpose. And if that challenge seems overbearing, then I would quote another sentence from Jimmy Reid's address. That mad though it may be to try and change this system, not doing so is even madder. So I think we take comfort from the fact that we want to prove that we are not entirely insane in saying the emperor is naked. It is time we did something about it. So that's where I get to my title. Why I'm not loving it will not just do it, and sure as hell will never be worth it. And I want to just cover 3 areas in the next 40 minutes or so. To say something more about the nature of marketing and the rhetoric versus the reality, which looks at some of the more obvious harms that marketing does, the things that were mentioned already, like tobacco use. But then I want to go on to dig a bit deeper and think more profoundly about the impact this world we've created of perpetual customer satisfaction, or maybe we should say dissatisfaction, and its impact it has on us as individuals, as communities, as a species. Start to think about what the purpose of our existence is. And that brings us back to Bukowski and the idea of our autonomy, our power to do something about this and where we are at. What is our life about? Why are we doing what we are doing? And I make no apologies for the fact that at that point I want to get into pretty heavy stuff, like death, for example. But I think we have to start thinking about these things if we're not just going to carry on like hamsters in the wheel of the marketing matrix. First of all, in marketing and rhetoric. Well, the language of marketing is actually rather reassuring. It talks about the customer, us, always being right, about consumer sovereignty, about the customer always coming first, about consumer choice, about customer satisfaction. And indeed, the textbooks will talk about marketing essentially being about producing what you can sell, not selling what you can produce. So everything, the whole bang shooting match, all those 150 millennia of money, that's all being organised just for our benefit, just to make us feel good, to give us exactly what we want. Now, if there's any theologians in the audience at this point, they'll be shaking a little bit, because any system that gives everybody exactly what they want is going to be catastrophic at some point. But leave that aside for the moment. We even use this phrase, I assume you use this in Australia, retail therapy, yeah? Yeah, the idea that this is sort of, if things are really bad, at least you can go out and shop and feel better again. So we have a story developing here which suggests that things are not just good, they are great, and the system is set up in perpetuity to ensure that continues to be the case. It all sounds very good, particularly if you happen to be like us, rich. You know, we conveniently forget for a moment that 2/3 of the world population is not in this position at all, but for us, oh my goodness, it's great. Everything we could want 24/7. But even in our little privileged world, I then think of another story. It's a story that didn't affect Australia terribly badly as it did in Europe, the global financial crisis of 2008. But it did affect Europe, and particularly it affected some of the more economically marginalised countries of Europe. One of those was Ireland. I was in Dublin in early 2009, just after the balloon had gone up. And I travelled into the city by taxi and fell into conversation with a taxi driver who was a man of my age, like me, had 3 grown-up children. And he told me how this had affected his life. During the years of the Celtic Tiger, the banks and financial institutions had marketed very carefully to people like my driver. And the message they put to them is that the best way you can help your kids is to get them onto the property ladder. You back them, you guarantee their mortgages, we'll give them the mortgages, and that's them set up for life. Well, he bought that message. For each of his adult daughters, he had signed the guarantee forms so that each of them had bought a flat in Dublin at the height of this insanity. Now, in 2009, each one of those young women was sitting on approximately €200,000, $300,000 in rough terms, of negative equity. That is life-ruining stuff. You don't get by that as a taxi driver. And even those who weren't caught on the hop, as my unfortunate taxi driver were, are living on credit. In Australia, government debt is not a particular problem. What about private debt, personal debt? People who are living beyond their means. In Dublin, they talk about the €30,000 millionaires. People who are living like millionaires but earning $30,000 a year and using the supposed money on their houses to fuel a completely unsustainable lifestyle. And again, it is happening in Dublin. Again, the crash will come. Again, the suffering will happen. We then turn to that holy trinity of public health. You know, vast majority of our lifestyle illnesses can come down to food, alcohol, and tobacco. So something like 2/3 of the Australian population, like the American population, like the British population, are now overweight or obese. In America's case, that's been calculated that in a couple of years it'll be taking up 20% of the health budget. It's a massive hit. Alcohol. It's the 3rd greatest cause of preventable death, premature death in the world. And that's despite the fact that about half the world's population doesn't drink at all. And of course, tobacco. 1 in 2 smokers, 8 million a year globally, according to the WHO, by 2030. Massive depredations. Matched, of course, by the holy trinity of corporate marketing. And I have spent most of my career proving the very obvious truth that this marketing has an effect. Frankly, bizarre waste of time, proving what Basil Fawlty would no doubt call the bleeding obvious. You spent hundreds of millions of pounds using evocative promotion to encourage the consumption of a product, hey, people consume it, particularly young people. So well established has this evidence base become that now the public health literature talks openly about the concept of the industrial epidemic. That is, an epidemic caused by business, by commercial activity, the marketisation of products that do harm. And all this starts all too young. This is a quote from a standard business textbook. It's not something obscure or abstruse. I used exactly this image at the class at my university in Scotland just last month, and one of the students said, oh yes, we did that last week in business studies. And what it says, and it's worth reading, children are important to marketers for three fundamental reasons. They represent a large market in themselves because they have their own money to spend. They influence their parents' selection of products and brands. And they will grow up to be the consumers of everything. A fell phrase if ever there was. Hence, marketers need to start building up their brand consciousness and loyalty as early as possible. Now, set aside that, alongside that, the fact that the Surgeon General last report showed that 88% of smokers start as children. We all know this to be true. If an adult friend were to offer you a cigarette and you said, no, thank you, he would not press you, or she would not press you. They would know if you said, no, you don't smoke, and you never will smoke. They wouldn't say, oh, try these, they're menthol, they're really, really nice, or, this is a particularly good sort of Virginia tobacco. It wouldn't happen. We know this is a pediatric epidemic. Looking at the diet side, and I'm going to need your help here, Sarah. We're going to try a bit of clever technology at this point. This is a Kellogg cereal, Crave, and this is their website. We'll try and get onto the website and see if we can animate this slightly. It's rather cute. I just want you to try and imagine who the target audience for this is. Very, very simple. What age do you think? Let's have a guess. Who says 10? 10-year-olds? 8-year-olds? Less? Okay. Our Daily Telegraph leader is probably down to 4 now. Thank you very much. This is a promotional tool for that product. It's a computer game. The game, this website advertises, deliberately recruits Crave Facebook fans to the existing Facebook community and provides current fans with new content. It engages fans with the brand and brings to light core ad concept underpinning Crave, to wit, the character's relentless pursuit of chocolate. Now, that's 2/3 of the population are now overweight or obese. Is there a link between these? But perhaps more profoundly, is there not something distasteful about children's desire for play, that fundamental development activity, being turned into a marketing opportunity, a profit opportunity? And where's that taking us if children's play is no longer commercially free? And it gets younger. I, for one, thought that the scandal of infant formula had gone away. I thought it had been dealt with. I thought the large multinationals selling this stuff had started to behave themselves. Not at all. This is Jasmine Whitbread, the CEO of Save the Children, right, talking just a few years ago. I shouldn't be standing in front of you on the 25th anniversary of the code, this is the code restricting marketing, telling you so little has changed and that companies continue to encourage mothers to spend money they don't have on manufactured food most of them don't need. I shouldn't be standing in front of you because it shouldn't still be happening. But it is, because the voluntary code clearly isn't working and children are dying as a result. These are fell words. But, you may argue, we are autonomous adults. We would not fall for this. We are educated, we are sophisticated decision makers. We wouldn't fall the sort of crap that gets us to spend £100 on Gucci bibs for our children or Would we? We're not so foolish as to do that. Really takes us to that issue of autonomy. Are we really standing above this, or are we in there struggling with it all the time, perhaps often unconsciously? I'd like to tell you a story and then ask you a question. I say the bit about asking the question, then you have to listen to the story. It was 45 minutes since the passenger liner had gone down. Jack and Alice found themselves sitting in a lifeboat. All in all, they felt that things could be a lot worse than they were. After all, they were in the lifeboat, and they were there with 6 other passengers from the passenger liner, and the lifeboat was designed to take 24. So there was plenty of room, plenty of blankets, plenty of food and water to keep them sustained, even if the search and rescue took a long time. So, as I say, they began to relax a little bit. Then one of their fellow passengers said that they thought they could see something in the water over where the liner had gone down. In fact, they thought they could see a person. They searched around in the lockers of the lifeboat and found a set of field glasses. And looked out, and sure enough, not just one, but several people in the water, clearly in distress, clearly needing help. So this kicked off a debate in the boat. Should they go and help the people, or should they stay put? Some people argued very vociferously for the former, that this was absolutely a fundamental good and bad issue, that the right thing to do was to go and help those people. They absolutely had to do it, and they should do it. Others, however, craved caution and argued that there was hazards in this, that if they went over to where the liner had been, they didn't know how many people would be in the water. Maybe the boat would become overcrowded. Maybe even the lifeboat would be overturned in the rush that would ensue. And what good would that do? Just 6 extra deaths. Well, the argument went one way, then the other. In the end, they decided that discretion was a better part of valour. And they stayed put. So Jack and Alice were able to relax even more, kick off their shoes, and start on the medicinal rum, of which there was, of course, plenty. My question to you is, did Jack and Alice and their fellow passengers make the right decision? Should we do it by a show of hands? Who says, no, they did not make the right decision? A lot of people. Are there any honest people in the audience? Thank you, sir. You are the one honest person. I apologise. I have been guilty of a misrepresentation. The story is not mine. It is from a moral philosopher, and it is a metaphor. The lifeboat is a metaphor for our planet. And we are all, like Jack and Alice, living in luxury, living with plenty, when so much of the world is going in want. This is Clive Ponting, a British historian, talking about the process of feeding the world. This is from A History of the World, as he wrote. After the mid-20th century, there was, for the first time in world history, enough food in the world to feed everybody adequately. The problem was, it was very unequally distributed. By the late 20th century, people of the industrialized countries of Western Europe, Japan, and North America, I think he's just forgotten Australia at this point, but that would be in there as well, ate half the world's food, though they constituted only a quarter of the world's population. A domestic cat in the US ate more meat than people living in Africa and Latin America. We are all implicated in that outrage. We might not even have known about it, but we ought to know about it. Does this feel like an autonomous decision that you have made? If we look at the world of medicines, this is Joel Bacon talking in The Corporation, pointing out that of the 1,400 new drugs developed between 1975 and 1999, only 13 were designed to treat tropical diseases and 3 to treat tuberculosis. More effort is put into trying to sort out problems of impotence and baldness than any of the tropical illnesses. Our trivial concerns are dealt with. Guess why? Not because our need is greater, but because our pockets are deeper. Even more dramatically, and this almost beggars belief, But because the multinational pharma companies wanted to protect their profits on antiretrovirals, they would not let generic medicines be used in sub-Saharan Africa. It's estimated some 10 million people died as a result of that decision, which was hard fought and defended for many, many years. And the defence that is sometimes put forward that these companies had to protect all their investment in producing these, 84% of the funding to find the cure for AIDS, the antiretrovirals, was public money. Does this feel like an autonomous decision? If we think about something as simple as coffee, and that the third world farmer will be, if he's lucky, getting just over £2 a kilo, whereas in the lifestyle marketing of the nice coffee outlet of a modern Western city, something like £450 a kilo. Immense inequalities. And inequalities are a massive problem for our society. Ironically and paradoxically, they're just as harmful to the rich as they are the poor. Because even a rich person needs an educated nanny to look after their children, needs a road to be able to get to the airport, needs a planet upon which to build their mansions. If we think about the boss of Coca-Cola, just one example. It's very unfair to pick on him. It's wrong of me, I know, but there we go. He owns this is old data now, so it's probably gone up a lot, but $25 million a year, which is shocking enough in its own right, but that is 730 times his median workers' pay. And that discrepancy has increased from 32 just 30 years ago. Massive, massive divergence in wealth. And think about that for a minute. £25 million. How would you spend $25 million? Just think, how would you do that? Give it some thought. Ponder on it. And then when you come to your conclusion, remember, we've got to do it again next year. However, if you are flummoxed, then a friendly local marketer will help you. This is a survey. You can go on to this. It's on the web. This is produced by the Financial Times, and it is called, unashamedly, How to Spend It. You can buy a second-hand Formula One car, for example. Or maybe a chronometer. I was going to say watch, but of course this is a chronometer. This is, in pounds, £26,000. Now this is a self-winding watch. You put it on and you walk around and it winds itself. It's a beautiful, beautiful piece of kit. It tells you the time on every planet in the galaxy. The problem with it is that you have to keep winding it. And if you're awfully, awfully rich and awfully, awfully stupid, you don't just want one of these, you want dozens of these, because you collect them. You become a connoisseur of timepieces. The solution is here. An automatic winder. A box equipped with an electronic motor and an artificial wrist to keep them wound for you. And guess what? It's a snip. It's only €86,000. Fantastic. But let's not get too arrogant about this. Think about our own lives. And the myth that we have. We live in this fictional world that we think we make intelligent purchase decisions. Bear in mind just one simple statistic. A large supermarket has approximately 40,000 lines on offer. Well, at a second apiece, it takes 11 hours to count to 40,000. Now, how many of you spend 11 hours in your local supermarket? Luckily, marketing helps us to choose with buy one, get one free offers, or mood music, or positioning, or soil sprinkled onto the potatoes, whatever it is, the smell even. Moving the product from the side aisle to the main aisle of a supermarket will increase sales by approximately 400%. That is pure impulse. That is not an intelligent consumption decision. If you have any doubts about this, read Robert Cialdini's book called Influence. And he's a psychologist of many years standing, very illustrious, and he just goes through the different techniques that are used, and we, self-empowered adults though we be, fall for them every time. This is Tesco in the UK talking about the amount of food wastage there is. In this case, they're talking about bagged salads. 35% of which is thrown away by consumers. And given another approximately 35% that's wasted in the shop, it's 2/3 of that product range that is simply thrown away. And this is an industry-wide problem. This is a report produced by that well-known neo-Maoist front group, the Institute of Mechanical Engineers, talking about how much waste there is in the system. Up to 30% of the UK's vegetable crop is never harvested because it's not pretty enough. Perfectly edible, it just doesn't look very pretty. That amounts to 1.6 million tonnes. And then, once it's bought, between 30 and 50% will be thrown away because we've fallen for those buy one, get one free offers, we're buying more than we need, and so on and so forth. Does this feel like intelligent, autonomous decision-making? Think about the digital world. We touched on it with Kellogg's Crave. A couple of years ago, Facebook announced that they'd struck a multi-million-dollar advertising partnership with Diageo, owner of drinks brands including Smirnoff and Guinness. A move to start exploiting social networking as a marketing tool. And this is Diageo's PR manager talking about what they did. Facebook are working with us to make sure that we are not only fan collecting, but they are actively engaged and driving advocacy for our brands. So they're not just selling things to us, they're getting us to sell them to each other. We are not just customers, we're part of the marketing team, albeit unpaid members of the marketing team. And that same press release went on to say how they are now focusing their efforts on developing countries. Essentially, having got us as pissed as it can possibly get us, they're now turning elsewhere for their customers. I think the question we need to start asking ourselves is not, do you use Facebook, but does Facebook use you? Does this feel like an autonomous decision? Thinking about values versus value. Very struck about the Olympic idea, and what a marvellous idea. The Olympics were in Britain last year, and it was a massive plus. It was so powerful. And indeed, because the Olympics were in the UK, the Olympic torch came through the town in which I live. And I took these images. This was the cavalcade that came through our town. If you look very carefully, you can see the Olympic torch. If we think about gender stereotyping, this slide was put together by the simple means of talking to one of my female colleagues and saying, just look at the stuff we've got in our folder on advertising for alcohol and electronic cigarettes and see if you can pick out any that you find offensive. This was about 2 minutes later she came back with this lot. And she basically just picked them at random, I think. And it's, what exactly is this saying about our values, about how women fit into our society, about what we think about how society should be organized? And just by being there in the media, they gain a degree of spurious legitimacy. Does this feel like an autonomous decision? And then think about our planet. These statistics abound, and despite the Australian government, I would suggest that we pay attention to them. As things are going, it's argued by WWF Australia that Australia is burning up 3 planets in its lifestyle. The UK is the same, if not worse. America is worse. Desperately unfair. And just one illustration. Again, I'm not going to get drawn into the arguments about climate science. I'm not qualified so to do. But this is a headline from our own independent newspaper in the UK, talking about the fact that they are now drilling for oil in the Arctic in areas that they couldn't previously drill for oil in. Guess why? Because the ice has melted because of the oil they burnt last time. It's like the guy sitting on the end of the branch and sawing it off, only more so. The problem, in a nutshell, is that we have ever-increasing growth, ever-increasing consumption, driven by marketing, and this is catastrophic. What is more, it's not just that it is happening, it's that we're all kind of okay with it. We all know that this is balmy, but somehow because the marketing keeps going or whatever it is, we somehow have learned to live with it. Does this feel like an autonomous decision? Okay, let's try and now turn this into the positives, because I am an optimist. I think there are ways we can move forward. There is a light out there. 3 things I want to leave you with. The idea of critical thinking, looking at what is happening and criticising it. The ideas of stories and the stories we want to tell about ourselves. And the idea of collective action, coming together, community, connecting. Starting with being critical. What I'd like to do is just show you a video. Quite old video.
Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States.
Good evening, my fellow Americans. We now stand 10 years past the midpoint of a century that has witnessed 4 major wars among great nations. Until the latest of our world conflicts, the United States had no armaments industry. American makers of plowshares could, with time and as required, make swords as well. But we can no longer risk emergency improvisation of national defense. We have been compelled to create a permanent armaments industry of vast proportions. Added to this, 3.5 million men and women are directly engaged in the defense establishment. Now, this conjunction of an immense military establishment and a large arms industry is new in the American experience. The total influence, economic, political, even spiritual, is felt in every city, every state house, every office of the federal government. We recognize the imperative need for this development, yet we must not fail to comprehend its grave implications. Our toil, resources, and livelihood are all involved. So is the very structure of our society. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes. We should take nothing for granted. Only an alert and knowledgeable citizenry can compel the proper meshing of the huge industrial and military machinery of defense with our peaceful methods and goals, so that security and liberty may prosper together.
Worth bearing in mind that's 50 years old, that Eisenhower was an ex-military man and a Republican, and yet he is warning us about things that have carried on growing. The military-industrial complex has become massively more powerful in the intervening years. I think the intensity of what he says speaks volumes. So that would be my first thought, that we should be critical, we should question the assumptions underpinning what we think to be true, to uncover what we can objectively state to be true, to be alert and knowledgeable citizen. We should tell our own stories. Nelson Mandela, when he was in Robben Island, took upon himself the task of briefing each new intake of prisoners as they came into the prison. Remember, these were young men who had, until very recently, been throwing petrol bombs at the hated representatives of the apartheid regime. And amongst other things, in all the many things he wanted to bring them to terms with at their time in this prison, he talked about tobacco. But he was far too sensible to lecture them or say, don't smoke, it's bad for you, or smoking isn't allowed, or whatever it might be. All he said was that, remember, nicotine is addictive, smoking is dependence-inducing. The guards know this, and they will supply your need on occasion. In return, of course, they will ask for favours. Sometimes your need for tobacco will be small and the favour will be small. But sometimes your need will be great. That's all he said. And he left it for them to then think about what they would do. And what he was doing there was enabling them to tell a story that they could be proud of. He was aligning a public health message, a rather boring holier-than-thou public health message, with their values. So the move away from tobacco came for them part of the move away from apartheid. I think what he illustrates to us is that we all have a great interest in the story we're going to tell about our lives. And this gets us into some very deep water indeed. It gets us into the recognition that we enter this world alone and we will leave it alone. However good our friends are, however much we love our partners, however much we love our children, that remains true. As of course, does the terrible fact that we know we will leave this world. We all know we are going to die. That leads us. On the one hand, it's an appalling recognition. On the other hand, it's an amazingly liberating one. Because remember, the only thing worse than dying is not dying. Immortality is a horrible prospect. And it's that knowledge of our own mortality that leads us to seek some higher purpose, some means to better ourselves. In Aldous Huxley's terrifying phrase, even if only we were to escape from the tormenting consciousness of being merely ourselves. We are looking for some higher meaning in what we are doing. We are looking for transcendence. And finding that transcendence, that transformation, is hard work. It is difficult. And Huxley talks very articulately about the dangers of bogus transformation. And I think the consumption offered by the marketing matrix is exactly that bogus liberation. This is Steinbeck writing in The Grapes of Wrath, but it's incredibly timious. If he needs 1 million acres to make him feel rich, it seems to me he needs it because he feels awful poor inside himself. And if he's poor in himself, there ain't no 1 million acres going to make him feel rich. And maybe he's disappointed that nothing he can do will make him feel rich. I ain't trying to preach no sermon. I never seen nobody that's as busy as a prairie dog collecting stuff that wasn't disappointed. Incredible resonance in those words written, getting on for a century ago now. What it speaks to is the complete myth of customer satisfaction. For God's sake, if we were satisfied consumers, we'd stop being consumers. We'd stop being customers. We don't do that. And this bogus liberation, this bogus transformation, creates immense political issues. This is Richard Sennett, a sociologist, talking about consumer-friendly. It makes a hash of democracy, because democracy is about hard work. It's about thinking about issues. It's about grappling with them. It's about challenging them. As he puts it, rather unkindly, few American proponents of the war in Iraq wanted to learn about Iraq. Most couldn't, in fact, locate it on a map. This is Huxley again. Again, a very powerful line here. A really efficient totalitarian state would be one in which the all-powerful executive of political bosses and their managers control an army of slaves who do not need to be coerced because they love their servitude. Arguably, that's what we are doing in a consumer society. We are loving the fact we have to work every hour God sends in order to buy the stuff in order to make us happy. Hey, what? It doesn't work. So we carry on working and buy some more stuff. As a result of the power this gives to large companies, we now have a situation where 91 of the largest economies on the planet are companies, not countries. As Aaron Harty-Roy points out, this gives them immense power. They can own everything. It's a bizarre state of affairs. And it's us that is giving them this power. Furthermore, if we think about this higher meaning, this purpose in life, surely if our life is about anything, it's about problem solving, it's about overcoming challenges. Just what would happen to the book of Genesis if Apple had run the Garden of Eden. We'd have had a smart app to stop Eve getting the apple. And what would be the knock-on effect for the philosophical development of Western thought? Transcendence is also very lonely work. We have to connect if we're going to be successful. We have to learn to listen and to link our stories. We have to think about collective opportunities. At this point, I just want to mention to you a very interesting book in this area called The Miner's Canary. And what Guinea and Torres are talking about is the metaphor of the miners taking the canary down the mines and arguing that that canary actually is a symbol of the need for change. We should recognize that it is an opportunity, therefore, to stimulate real change. The marginalized are like the miner's canary. Their distress is the first sign of a danger that threatens us all. So disadvantaged communities signal problems with the way we have structured power and privilege. And they go on to argue that if the miners only listened to the canary, they would hear him say that, hey, I can't breathe, but you know what? You are being poisoned too. If you save me, you save yourself. Why is the mine owner sending us all down here to be poisoned anyway? And at that point, there's a real chance for change. At the top of this symposium, the usual respects were paid to the Indigenous peoples of Australia. But I think we can go a step further. Arundhati Roy again, talking about how we get out of the mess we have got ourselves into. She starts off by saying, what is for certain is that people who got us into this mess will not be the ones to get us out of. She calls for another imagination, an imagination outside of capitalism as well as communism, an imagination that has an altogether different understanding of what constitutes happiness and fulfillment. She goes on to argue that greater recognition of Indigenous people may be a starting point there. Not that they have all the answers, but they might have some of them. And one of the things they do seem to have got their head around, in some instances at least, is sustainable living. This is a famous quote from a Native American Indian. Before our white brothers arrived to make us civilized men, we didn't have any kind of prison. Because of this, we had no delinquents. Without a prison, there can be no delinquents. We had no locks nor keys, and therefore among us there were no thieves. When someone was so poor he couldn't afford a horse, a tent, or a blanket, he would, in that case, receive it all as a gift. We were too uncivilized to give a great importance to private property. We didn't know any kind of money, and consequently the value of human beings was not determined by his wealth. We had no written laws laid down, no lawyers, no politicians, therefore we were not able to cheat and swindle one another. We were really in bad shape before the white man arrived, and I don't know how to explain how we were able to manage without these fundamental things that, so they tell us, are so necessary for a civilized society. So let me finish off now. And I want to finish finally with an appeal to you for help. Marketers and marketing are extremely powerful. But Bukowski is right. We all have power. We just have to learn to exercise it. And we are seeking change. I say this with confidence because I have talked about this material over the last 2 years to many audiences in many parts of the world. And as one of the final points of these talks, I have asked people for ideas about change. So what I want to do is finish off by saying the 10 most popular things that people have said. But I say these in all humility because this is an Australian audience. You have the courage, you have the chutzpah of the Australian, because I think what we're looking for here is not just timid solutions. We're looking for disruptive solutions. We're looking for people to do things that will throw a spanner in the works of a machine that's going badly wrong. Some of the suggestions. Make all our shopping choices moral choices, maybe even political choices. List 10 things that make you happy. Count how many of them depend on shopping. Calculate your servitude index. How long after tax, for example, it takes you to earn $10. Resist much, obey little. Pay attention. Maybe particularly pay attention to marginalised communities who don't normally get listened to. And maybe just accept there's a good reason why we have one mouth and two ears. Self-produce something you would have bought. Disloyalty cards. Don't cut them up. Just swap with your friends once a month. That really, really messes with the databases. When you move from Sanatogen to disposable nappies in a month, the computer starts to sort of overboil. Stop wearing logos. Oh, get a favourite wildflower. Now, this is a reference to a book I read recently by a woman called Melanie Challenger. She is discussing a lot of the issues we've discussed tonight, and her concern is that we have become too distant from nature. I think she's onto something. And what tripped her up was that she was talking about her grandmother, and she remembered that her grandmother had a favourite wildflower. And Melanie Challenger sat there herself and thought, I just don't know enough wildflowers to have a favourite one. So her advice was, find out enough about wildflowers to have a favourite. A sort of, if you will, a very soundbite version of Clancy of the Overflow. Finally, and I think probably the most important one, tell 4 friends about this stuff. That was suggested by somebody who worked in community development. So there is potential for change, and I think we all need it. I was in Edinburgh just before I came away, and I walked down the street, and a scene that you will all have experienced of a homeless person sitting there with a little cardboard sign in front of them, and I had that usual conflict of, do I give them money? Should I give them money? How do I do this? Embarrassing. Do I just walk past and not make eye contact? How do I deal with this? And then I caught what was written on this sign. And I thought, yeah, you are so right. So that would be my final thought to leave you with. What are your ideas for bringing about this change? Thanks for listening.
Well, thank you, Gerard. I'd now like to invite Katrina Mackenzie from Macquarie University to give a response to Gerard's amazing talk. Katrina is Professor of Philosophy and Director of Macquarie University's Research Centre for Agency, Values and Ethics. She has an extensive publication record in moral psychology, social and political philosophy, feminist philosophy and applied ethics, and is the winner of the 2000 Eureka Prize for Ethics. Katrina.
Well, I just want to thank Gerard Hastings for a provocative and engaging, if disturbing, talk. And I want to, in my response, sort of connect what he's been saying to some of the themes of the symposium on public health. I've long held the view that philosophers, bioethicists and public health experts have spent a lot of time worrying about the extent to which state regulation of individual choice may compromise our freedom and autonomy. But we've overlooked the pervasive role of corporate capitalism and its marketing machine in manipulating and shaping our individual preferences and choices. Professor Hastings has provided us with a powerful analysis of why corporate marketing of junk food, tobacco, alcohol and consumer culture more generally may constitute a more insidious threat to our freedom and well-being than public health intervention by the state. His talk has highlighted the potentially catastrophic threefold effect of this nexus between marketing and multinational corporations. First, in damaging the health and well-being of individuals. Secondly, in perpetuating social inequality and perpetuating social inequality. And thirdly, in fueling environmental degradation of the planet. So in this response, what I want to do is to highlight an aspect of Professor Hastings' presentation that connects with the work that I've done on autonomy, and also, as I said, that connects with the sort of central themes of this symposium on public health and the nanny state. As Professor Hastings mentioned in his talk, marketing spin and the rhetoric of consumer sovereignty allow corporations which produce products that cause ill health to deny responsibility for the effects of their products. They do so by appealing to the idea, as he put it, that we are educated, autonomous adults who are and should be left free to make our own choices. Marketing doesn't manipulate our preferences, or so the rhetoric goes. It just informs us of products that meet our wants. Now, what I want to do is explain why this conception of autonomy underpinning this rhetoric is impoverished. And I'll then present the outlines of an alternative approach to autonomy, I think a more adequate approach, which I think is particularly helpful for public health. So brand marketing and ideas of consumer sovereignty appeal to a libertarian, or what I've elsewhere called a maximal choice view of autonomy. The libertarian or maximal choice view equates autonomy with the satisfaction of individuals' preferences, no matter how arbitrary, prejudiced, manipulated, or self-destructive these preferences might be. And this view also holds that autonomy is best promoted by maximising the range of choices available to individuals and minimising regulatory and other forms of constraint on individual choice. Now, this rhetoric of maximising choice in the name of promoting personal autonomy goes hand in hand with the idea that individuals must take personal responsibility to manage the risks attendant upon their choices, and it also goes hand in hand with a de-emphasis on the social responsibilities of corporations and of governments to ensure that the burdens of risk are not borne disproportionately by the disadvantaged. The rhetoric also conveniently overlooks the ways in which individual choice is shaped by powerful social forces, including corporate marketing, as Professor Hastings has so brilliantly shown. So this is why the libertarian conception of autonomy is so appealing to anti-regulation advocates in areas such as junk food marketing, tobacco, and so on. What are the philosophical kind of roots of and justifications for this conception of autonomy, this libertarian or maximal choice conception? Philosophically, this view is underpinned by several overlapping justifications. The first is what's known as the liberal neutrality thesis. And this is the idea that in a pluralist society such as ours, there's no non-controversial basis for making normative judgments about how people should live their lives or what values ought to guide their choices. Each individual, so it's thought, therefore has a right to live her own life as she chooses and to be regarded as the best judge of what's in her interests. The role of the state on this view is to help secure the minimal social, political and economic conditions required to enable individuals to lead lives of their own choosing. However, the state on this view has no business supporting particular values or imposing unnecessary restrictions on people's choices. Second assumption is that according to the liberal or libertarian or maximal choice view, the freedom necessary for autonomy is negative liberty, the freedom being free from the interference by other persons or by the state. Such interference can only be justified on this view in cases where a person's preferences or their liberty threatens to cause harm to the liberty of others, or threatens to cause harm to others. And harm's here usually interpreted as direct physical harm. Third assumption on this view, the main threat to autonomy is coercive or paternalistic interference by other persons or by the state. The role of corporations in manipulating and shaping people's needs, desires and preferences doesn't count as objectionable interference with freedom. Now, there is, of course, something importantly right about the idea of state neutrality with respect to people's value systems. This ideal has played a central role in securing political and personal freedoms that most people in Western liberal democracies regard as crucial to their ability to lead autonomous lives. We don't want the state interfering with all aspects of our lives and our decision-making. But I want to suggest that the ideal of state neutrality is also a piece of ideology. The state can and does play a crucial role in shaping our values, for example, the values required for democratic citizenship, and the state can and does play a central role in fostering our autonomy. And this is why it's a mistake to think that negative liberty, merely freedom from interference, is sufficient for autonomy. To give substance to our liberty, we need, and to lead an autonomous life, we need access to genuine opportunities. And that means access to social goods such as education, healthcare, housing and social support, adequate nutrition, sanitation and personal safety, opportunities for political participation and paid or unpaid employment, and some degree of mobility, just to mention some of the things that are necessary for leading an autonomous life. These goods require complex economic, social and political infrastructures, and they require a well-functioning state. So the libertarian or maximal choice conception of autonomy places too much emphasis on negative liberty or freedom from interference, while overlooking the importance for individual autonomy of access to these social goods and the opportunities they make available. And furthermore, in a context in which corporate marketing is so overwhelmingly powerful in shaping individual choice, as Professor Hastings has shown, it's a mistake to think that the main threats to personal autonomy are coercion and nanny state paternalism. State regulation and public health interventions are in fact crucial for countering the often malign influence of corporate capitalism on people's autonomy and well-being. Now, in the last section of his presentation, Professor Hastings talked about the importance of reasserting or reclaiming our autonomy to counter the powerful influence of corporate marketing. I want to say something very briefly about an alternative conception of autonomy, a relational conception, that I suggest ought to be quite congenial to Professor Hastings and that I think is particularly fruitful in the context of debates about public health and nanny state paternalism. In contrast to the libertarian view that negative liberty is sufficient for autonomy, the relational conception holds that autonomy is a complex competence, and its development and exercise requires extensive and ongoing interpersonal, social and institutional scaffolding. Relational autonomy theorists seek to analyse the nature of autonomy competence. They also seek to show to understand the kind of social scaffolding that's required in order to enable us to become competent, autonomous persons. And they also seek to show how autonomy can be thwarted by forms of social oppression, inequality and injustice. Relational autonomy theorists are particularly attentive to the social constraints and influences on individual choice. And they also argue that what matters for autonomy is not the mere proliferation of choice, endless shopping opportunities or maximising the choices available to us, but what's important is the range of significant and meaningful opportunities that are available to individuals and social groups. So if we're interested in promoting people's autonomy, we need to be concerned with the social distribution of opportunities. That is, with questions such as whether there are significant inequalities in the opportunities available to members of different social groups, whether these inequalities perpetuate social injustice and exploitation. For a relational autonomy theorist, then, an interest in promoting autonomy goes hand in hand with an interest in social justice. And that approach to autonomy, I suggest, resonates with Professor Hastings' view that disadvantaged individuals and communities are like the canary in the coal mine, signalling social pathologies, problems with the way in which we as a society have structured power and privilege. I think a relational approach to autonomy is particularly relevant to public health because it's concerned with the social constraints on individual choice and the social distribution of opportunities can help focus attention on the background conditions that shape individual health choices. For example, in poor communities, food choices, such as high levels of consumption of junk food, are often shaped not just by corporate marketing, although that's a very powerful factor, but also by factors such as the low cost and ready availability of junk food compared with the relatively higher cost and often not very availability of fresh fruit and vegetables, by factors like insufficient education concerning nutrition, things like time poverty due to long working hours and so on. So according to relational autonomy theorists, in contexts like these, the consumption of junk food is often not an autonomous choice. Professor Hastings kept asking us again and again, is this an autonomous choice? And relational autonomy theorists would say, no, it's not. In contexts like that, these choices are constrained choices. Public health interventions that seek to counter these factors in a range of appropriately targeted and, importantly, non-stigmatising ways, for example, by regulating junk food advertising through health promotion campaigns, school nutrition programs and so on, these initiatives don't limit but in fact foster people's autonomy. But relational autonomy theorists would also agree with Professor Hastings that these kinds of interventions, although they're important, are not sufficient. If public health is seriously concerned with reducing health inequalities, then it must also enlist the support of the state and non-government agencies to address the social, economic, educational and environmental inequalities that cause and perpetuate health inequalities. So I just want to make another suggestion to add to Professor Hastings' list, and that is, well, what does it mean to reassert our autonomy? I think to reassert our autonomy, we first of all need to rethink the concept of autonomy itself. We need to reclaim and reinterpret the concept. We need to reject the libertarian maximal choice conception that I think fits so nicely with this marketing matrix that Professor Hastings has been talking about, that's the whole rhetoric of consumer sovereignty and marketing, and we need to rethink the concept of autonomy as relational. And in doing so, I think we can begin to reassert our autonomy. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have about 15, 18, 20 minutes for questions. We'll have 2 microphones going on either side of the room. I would ask you please to speak into the microphone, so please make sure the microphone is on before you make your question and comment. Please keep your questions and comments fairly brief so that we have time to have a number of people to speak. Who's first? The gentleman in the red.
As an economist, and that's not a biased question, what kind of economy, or would there be an economy produced if we follow through 100% with your concept?
Is that a question for me? Yeah, well, shall I start off and then you take over, Katrina? I'm not trying to evade your question, but I don't think I have an answer. I'm not proposing an alternative, except in the sense that we should question what we're doing at the moment and try and find that alternative. I don't think this is about saying we've got to dismantle capitalism and putting forward, a Leninist perspective or something of that sort. I suspect what we would end up with is something similar to what we have now, but much more tightly regulated. I would like to see marketing seen as a responsibility rather than just a right. And I think what's happening again and again in these situations is decisions are being made and products are being launched, campaigns are being run without any real attention being paid to the externalities. Somebody has to pick up the tab for this. Just before I came out on this trip, I was talking to a journalist who had done effectively a sting operation, trying to look at the digital marketing of food to children. And he'd gone into a couple of ad agencies with a product that just made up. It got mocked up, a nice, a very, very sweet drink. I mean, it was a mixture. It had as much sugar in as Coca-Cola and an orange squash mixed together. So, I mean, this was horrifically sugary. And he asked these, he was pretending to be a marketer, wanted to sell this thing, and he asked these people to pitch for it. And they came up with all sorts of ideas for doing this. But at no point in this conversation did anybody say, well, actually, I wouldn't like a child near this stuff. It would, the nearest it came to any recognition of that was one of them taking a swig of it and saying, oh, that'll take your teeth out, won't it? But no question. So I think I don't have a fixed answer, but I think we need a system that recognises those externalities. Somebody at the back.
Professor, I enjoyed your talk thoroughly. I can appreciate sort of the impetus and the stress on sort of processed foods and, our state's about to mine under 3 national parks for coal seam gas and, the disasters are endless, basically. But is it a little even more insidious than that? I mean, we're sort of talking about, public health, for example, and, it's not the healthcare system, it's the disease care system. And, our reductionist society is all about a pill for this. It'll solve this number of diseases and so forth. But even when it comes to just general nutrition, we're eating 1/10 of the number of foods that Australian Aborigines ate up in the tropics in a year. Yeah. The quality of those foods is probably another order of magnitude lower these days than it was. And so when, public health people are saying, oh, eat more fruit and vegetables, well, a mango has 3% more sugar than a can of Coke, weight per weight. Fibre in sweet potatoes, gone. It's no longer a low GI food. There's countless examples. Most of these fruit juices and fruit-based juices are based on high sugar, rubbish foods. Grapes, apples are now rubbish. And we're looking at these nutritionally dilute products that are underpinning the reason that 63% of Australians are overweight or obese. Where does it stop? How do you see when, in many ways, it's just insidious that we're trapped in this whole system where even our fresh fruits and vegetables are no longer worth eating because the supermarkets are demanding something that's bulletproof from farm to plate?
Thank you. There's a lot in what you've said there, and I won't try and unpick it all. But I think one of the words you use there was processing. And I think there's a really insidious formula operating in our diet, which is that it is processing, from natural fruit, even be a mango with lots of sugar in it, through to whatever it turns into, a fruit bar or something of that sort, or a drink based on the mango. That process of taking it through that processing does two things. First of all, it vitiates the nutritional quality. And secondly, it generates the marketing budget. So if you sell potatoes, you'll sell them for a few cents a pound. If you sell potato chips, then that comes up to pounds or dollars per pound. So, and essentially, you've got this really unhelpful dynamic going on then, that the stuff that gets the push behind it, all the marketing behind it, is the least healthy stuff. So, I end up in a place where, which this maybe isn't a very helpful remark, but I think, just don't eat processed foods. Do not do it. So there was a paper in the Lancet last year talking about obesity and, amongst other things, a broad look at public health. And one of the conclusions of that is essentially processed foods are extremely questionable. And just try and eat as naturally as you can in the sense of understanding what you are consuming. I don't know whether the scandal, the rumours of the scandal reached Australia, but last year we had a terrible scandal when horse meat was found in supermarket meat. Did that hit here? And that really writ large that even the people who are selling this stuff don't really know what's in it, because their supply chains have become so protracted and so complex and so open to manipulation. So, for what it's worth, don't eat processed foods.
Michael Moore from the Public Health Association. I just want to give you I'm just here.
Thank you.
I just want to give you almost a catalyst for a comment. I've been watching politics for a long time, and I constantly hear from all sides of politics the notion of economic growth. I don't think I've ever heard anybody talk about economic sustainability.
I think you're right, and this is absolutely cuts to the core of it all. And I'm not an economist, and I don't feel particularly skilled in discussing that. But I think it's absolutely fundamental. We've got to start asking that question, and hand in glove with it goes with the essence of the corporation, which critical though I have been of them, in a sense you can't blame them. We demand of corporations that they produce shareholder value. They increase shareholder value all the time. They have to do that. And if they don't do it, in a competitive market, they get overtaken and taken over and somebody else does it. So that which speaks to not just dealing with the issue of unsustainable economic growth, but also the fiduciary imperative of companies having to focus on the bottom line the whole time. And that is the only value they take account of. Ultimately, it drives everything. So I think we have to start thinking about that. These are really fundamental questions, and because that fiduciary imperative is there for very good reasons. So you can't just say, "Well, we'll get rid of that." You've got to think through how that would be. But we need to start asking them. But yeah, I find it incredibly depressing that our leaders seem to want nothing more devoutly than a return to 2008. Insanity. I don't know where the microphone is, but there's somebody here and there's somebody here. Oh, sorry, I do apologize. Yeah.
My name's Gerard Hosier. Both both professors have stated that libertarianism is part of the problem in terms of us having too much choice, I guess. Who is the noble group that is going to fill the void to guide us to an ideal lifestyle, and is a centralized government, centralized marketing, or centralized production the solution?
I don't think there is any ideal solution. I think there's a number of different voices that are required, and really I guess the theme of this, so we're now joined with the theme of this symposium is really to counter, I suppose, some of the nanny state rhetoric that does seem to be so widespread in Australia, and I think also in the US, whether it goes by that name or not, and similarly in the UK and in a range of other sort of democratic countries, to counter that rhetoric and to say, well, actually the state has an important role to play. We do have reasons to be wary about state intervention. We shouldn't be uncritical of state intervention, but the sort of knee-jerk, as Roger was talking about at the beginning, the kind of knee-jerk nanny state
overreach.
Yeah, and then the idea that once you've said that, well, that's an argument that defeats anything that anybody can say about state regulation. That's something that needs to be countered, and I think it requires a number of different players. It requires the state, it requires non-government organisations, public health experts, and consumer groups. I mean, a range of different groups to solve this, to tackle this kind of problem.
And how about the manufacturers? Because I mean, they're a major player.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, yeah, corporate social responsibility is got to be crucial to this. But we don't see a lot of evidence in some of the industries that Gerard was talking about, tobacco, junk food, and alcohol. They're probably some of the least responsible industries with respect to corporate social responsibility. Did you want to?
Yeah, I think I'd just add, just to make people more depressed, a cautionary note about corporate social responsibility. I think very often that is no more than marketing targeted at stakeholders rather than consumers. So so I think we need to be careful of that. But the idea of the government making decisions and an overweening government, what we've got at the moment is a situation where decisions being made in the free market, which is a mythical concept anyway, given the power of these corporations now. It's not free at all. But decisions made in the free market are severely constraining democratic governments. So, 1 in 5 health dollars going to dealing with obesity. That's a major constraint on what the US government is going to do in the next 10 years. And we need to, so I'm all for a choice, for a debate about choice, and not limiting choice, and keeping people free insofar as we can be free. But let's make it a real choice. So when people bring things to market, they should have to justify bringing those things to market. Just the fact that somebody's prepared to buy it is not sufficient justification. Let's look at what it really costs to bring this. So, to me, it's just a no-brainer that the tobacco industry should be required to pick up the tab for what they have done. And if they were required to pay the real costs of tobacco, they'd stop doing it in a blink, because it just ain't worth it.
But then, as you were talking about the cost of junk food and it being the most cost-effective way of feeding poor people, I mean, by moving the goalposts, that will create more problems. In fact, all the sort of solutions put forward by governments quite often create unseen circumstances or byproducts that aren't necessarily the outcomes that we really wanted in the beginning. And we just continue and continue.
I appreciate your comment, but could we move on, please? The lady in the...
I'm just going to cheat and say I'm not sure I totally buy the idea of junk food eating being an economically advantageous way forward. I think ultimately it's not.
Hi, over on the other side of the room. My name's Roshni.
Oh, hello.
I'm a current postgrad student at the University of Sydney. I did my honours research on environmental consumption, looking at, first of all, when people go shopping in a supermarket, what their environmental values and ethics are, and then secondly, whether their product choices actually reflect this. And I found basically it came down to money, what was cheapest and what was easiest. So my concern is that corporations are jumping on the bandwagon of this whole we need to shop smarter with things like greenwashing and marketing exotic health foods as better than, you know, your average fruits and veggies and things, so that people will spend more money on things that they don't actually, things that aren't any better necessarily than the average products that are available, and kind of trying to discourage people from thinking outside of the box and going back to more sustainable practices. I was wondering if you had any thoughts on how we could actually more actively be less isolated in progressive thinking?
Ooh, it's a big question. I suppose I'd fall back on a fairly conventional answer, which is, you know, there's two sides to the coin. One is that you have to constrain the marketing. I think we are really, really bad at judging value in that monetary sense, you know, whether something is a bargain or not. You know, the traditional definition of a bargain my grandmother used to use is something that you wouldn't have bought at half the price you wouldn't have paid for it. You know, so Cialdini again, you know, reinforces this. You know, the power of something being labelled free. But it's free. You know, I obviously just flew out here, and you know, when I got on the plane, they gave me this nice wash kit. Oh, that's lovely. There was nothing in that wash kit I will ever use, bar a little tube of toothpaste. But my goodness, it feels great that they are giving me this. Of course, they're not really giving me it. They've charged me for it, but it's just hidden. So, you know, we're terribly bad at that. So I absolutely sympathise with you, that problem of people going in and making their purchase decisions and then getting them wrong because they get seduced by the cheapness of a particular offer. But I think the other side of it is we have to take responsibility. We can't, I don't subscribe to the idea that it's all their fault, therefore we are innocent in this. We are engaged in this. We are making decisions. We are spending money. And, you know, we have to sometimes, you know, make the hard decision and spend more for the better, ethically, product. So, you know, I'll be an advocate of fair trade, for example. And we, you know, but I think that's fairly easy to do if we start to think about the implications of what we're doing. You know, if you think I am buying this pineapple from Costa Rica, despite the fact that the food companies, the fruit companies there, you know, have got rid of trade unions, they compel people to work on very poor conditions, on very poor wages, you know, and you are cooperating with that. You are there pushing those workers into these horrible circumstances. And I think if you know, the pineapple starts to taste pretty horrible after a while.
Yeah, thank you very much. My question is partly an observation. Most of the people here, I would suggest, are relatively educated people, partly because they're here at a lecture like this. My concern is that we ourselves are fairly well affected by the type of marketing that you refer to. How do you disseminate critical thinking to the rest of the population who don't come to these sort of lectures? For surely, without the critical thinking, you can't have the autonomy that you're seeking.
Thank you for asking the question. It's a difficult one to ask because it raises, and I could hear people sort of muttering as you were asking it. It's a tricky one. But my reaction would be that, you know, this might be an educated gathering of you know, people who've got more degrees than they really know what to do with, and so on. But I would fall back on Bukowski. I do not think that factors across to, you know, the people who don't come here are somehow ill-educated and foolish or stupid in any way. I think they're perfectly capable of seeing through this stuff. And actually, I think the tragedy for us is that public health underestimates those people, even as McDonald's and Coke do not underestimate them. They recognise their autonomy and their power, and they use seductive ways to get around it. So you know, I suppose as well as Bukowski, Jimmy Reed, you know, he was very much a representative of exactly the sort of people you're talking about, and they were capable and are capable of doing marvellous things. So I ultimately would reject what you're saying. I don't think we are sort of uniquely able in this regard, and I certainly don't think we are immune to marketing either. I think we are all of us. I know I am. I'm prey to it. I fall for the buy one, get one frees all the time. You know, it's a mistake to think that we are. And the response, I suppose, ultimately has to be a collective one. We have to join hands with people in all sections of society and say we're all being disadvantaged by this. We should stand together to change it.
I can take one last question.
Thanks for your talk. It's been terrific. I'd like to ask a simple question. Is there any nation state in the world that actually does not allow tax deductibility for marketing and for advertisements? So we've currently got a treasurer who's going to have a balance the budget, and overnight, we could say that all advertising and marketing and market researching could be not tax deductible. They could still do it, but we wouldn't be subsidising it. Okay? Do you know of any nation state in the world that has done that?
I don't, and it's going to become another little speech bubble on that last slide. So thank you for making the point. I think it's a really interesting one.
Can I just say, back in the 1950s, we had those terrific books by Vance Packard, an investigative journalist on waste makers, but also in-depth psychology.
The Hidden Persuaders.
Spelled that out very well.
Yeah. I think The Hidden Persuaders is a great book. It doesn't quite address a political solution. It sees this as an aberration rather than a systemic problem, I think, but it's a very good book. And while we're on the notion of books, I think a slightly more recent vintage, but not that much more recent, one I would recommend is Schumacher's Small is Beautiful. People know that. You've perhaps read it a long years ago, but worth revisiting. He does get it in a very, very remarkable way.
Ladies and gentlemen, would you please thank our speakers?